Greetings, everybody. Welcome to another exciting lecture by your favorite professor, Dr. Ronald Brown. Our topic for today is something very important to everybody from New York, and that is the age of the skyscraper. When did the skyscraper come into existence? Why? What was necessary? And how has the famous New York skyline been the inspiration of every country, every city that wants to be famous? So we're going to explore that history, fascinating history, today. Once again, this is the outline. Building up and building down. Well, there are only two, or actually three ways that you can build. You can build up into the sky, you can build underground, or you can expand horizontally. Well, unfortunately, Manhattan is an island, so it's very difficult to expand horizontally. So New York expanded down into the ground, subway and basements and underground arcade. And today's topic, it was going up into the sky. Number two, prerequisites for skyscrapers. What was necessary before you could build a skyscraper? I mean, the ancient Egyptians didn't build skyscrapers, nor did the Romans, nor did the ancient Chinese. But today, everybody is. So what's necessary to build a skyscraper? The origin of the skyscraper in Chicago, then its arrival in New York City, and then the message of skyscrapers. For example, during the Great Depression, building Rockefeller Center, building the Empire State Building, building the Chrysler Building, and so many other skyscrapers. What was the message? Number six, the World Trade Center, the queen of New York skyscrapers for a good number of years. And then finally, the skyscraper going global, becoming the symbol of the modern, forward-looking city. So let's get going and explore the skyscraper. Well, as you can see from the graph, New York City population has been growing. When you look back at 1810, it was still a small city, only reaching 1 million at about shortly after the American Civil War. And then literally skyrocketing. Today, it's still going up. This is 1990. Well, we are 2023 almost, or 2022. So it is now pushing 9 million. So the city has grown. Look at the other lines. You see Staten Island still remains underpopulated. Queens, Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bronx. The top line is all of the boroughs together. So New York had to grow somewhere. Well, when we look at the map of the New York City as we see it today, on the left, you see that there's Queens and Brooklyn, nestled on the western edge of Long Island. You have the Bronx up in the north, Manhattan, and Staten Island. Well, excuse me. Well, New York is a city of islands. If you look at the picture at the bottom on the right, you see the green area with trees. Well, that was Manhattan Island when the Dutch were here. The Dutch threw their garbage and unwanted stones and dirt into the East River and the Hudson River, almost doubling the width of Lower Manhattan as the city grew in population. In fact, if you look at the picture on the upper area, you see making land. There was even a plan to link Governor's Island enlarge that island and link it to Manhattan to extend Manhattan way out into the upper New York Bay. So New York from the beginning has had to grow, whether it was the Dutch and the English and the later United States independence, filling in the Hudson River and the East River, but you could only fill in the rivers so much. I mean, the Hudson River especially had to have room for water to flow. So if you look at the map at the bottom on the right, on the left of Manhattan, you see that line out into the Hudson River. That's actually where the World Trade Center is today and where the original towers were. They're not even on Manhattan. They're on landfill, which is dirt that the city fathers dumped into the Hudson River, built it up, and then built skyscrapers on it. So New York is, like Venice, a city of islands, like St. Petersburg in Russia, a city of islands. Well, following the Civil War, New York City was booming in population. By 1870, it had reached 1.5 million. Within 20 years, it had added another million. Within another 20 years, it had added another 2.5 million. By 1970, it was 8.5. In 2017, it was 8.5 million. And today it is somewhere, depending on how you count people and the effects of COVID-19, but it is somewhere around 8.5 or even more. So the city was growing. On the right, we see the Statue of Liberty, and behind it, we see Ellis Island, the immigration center, which brought in millions of Italians, Eastern European Jews, and Orthodox Christians and Catholics flooding into New York City between 1870 and 1914. 1914, the gates of immigration slammed shut during World War I, and they only reopened in 1965. So this period brought in millions of immigrants. Well, it was difficult to build down. You couldn't build apartment blocks under the ground. Who'd want to live in a cave? So the city had to decide where it was going to build. Well, it could only fill in so much land from the Hudson and East River. But by the late 1800s, a new kind of living situation became available. And these were the skyscrapers. Well, the only time you could actually build a skyscraper was in the late 1800s, because you needed more than just wood and cement and stones to build a skyscraper. The prerequisites for skyscrapers came into place, came into being in the late 1800s. The first one was steel and iron beams. If you look at any room, you will see that along the roof and over the windows, there are originally steel beams. So you could go from one area to another inside a house a much longer distance than you could with wood, stone, bricks. We see the steel beams when we look at a bridge today. Look at the various bridges around New York. You see the skeleton. Well, this same skeleton is what's inside of skyscrapers. We just cover over the beams with paint and plaster and sometimes brick and glass. So when you look at a skyscraper like the one on the right, the Woolworth building, nobody sees the steel beams which are inside. So steel and iron beams, sometimes as long as a room, were readily available by the late 1800s. Well, if you had a big open space and a tall building, you wanted light to come in. So by the 1880s, it was possible to make big pieces of glass. Before the 1880s, windows were usually very small, or they were made with small panes of glass, about a foot square or even less, because that's all the flat glass they could make. But by the 1880s, these giant storefront windows, yards in size, were able to be made. So you could build a big building and you could fill it with big windows. And on the ground floor, you could have stores displaying all their products in giant storefront windows. The third prerequisite was the elevator. Well, the elevator came into existence shortly after the Civil War, but they were dangerous. Everybody was afraid to get in an elevator because what would happen if the cable would break and you would go plummeting down into the basement and everybody would be killed? Well, it was Elisha Otis. That's a name you see on a lot of elevators until today. He invented a safety lock so that if the cable in the elevator broke and the elevator started to fall, immediately there was a safety lock that would freeze the elevator so it wouldn't fall down into the basement. And finally, electricity. If you're going to have a big building, well, windows on the outside brought in light. But if you had an office on the interior, you wanted electric light bulbs. You needed electric lighting in the long corridors that were totally dark because they had no windows. You needed electricity for the elevators, which became very efficient, very silent. And so once all these four prerequisites were in place, it was possible to build giant skyscrapers. Well, here we see all of the prerequisites coming into place. Picture on the left, you see the steel skeleton going up on a skyscraper. See all the steel and iron beams inside. And the bottom half is already covered over with big sheets of cement or bricks or wood or something. So you don't really see the skeleton anymore. But behind it, on both sides, you see other buildings going up and you see the steel skeleton. All these steel pieces sticking up in the air, which are going to be covered like the building in the middle, and so you won't see them. Inside, of course, you had the stairwell going up, but you had the early iron elevators, and you could go up and down very quickly, maybe not quickly enough for some people, but it was possible to go to the top of a building. Who wants to do all of those stairs? You'd have a heart attack and drop dead. And so the early elevators made it possible to go up to the top of the building. Electric lights lighted the corridor. So even if there were no windows, you didn't have to be afraid walking down the corridor. Even if you had an interior office or an apartment that had only windows on one side, well, you could go into the bathroom and turn on the light and close the door. An electric light made it possible. Well, all these elements came together and people started thinking about tall buildings, and gradually they started to go up in cities like New York and Chicago and San Francisco, gradually had some early skyscrapers. Well, the skyscraper really took off after the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. For 3 days, the city burned. See the painting on the left showing the ships in the harbor and the city being totally demolished. Well, on the right, you see what was left after the fire had gone through. Well, most of the buildings were of wood, or even if they had brick on the outside, all the floors were of wood. And so when fire started sweeping through the city, there was literally nothing to stop the entire city from burning. Well, in the 1870s, Chicago was a booming city. During the Civil War from 1860 to 65, Chicago was the city that fed the American army. New York relied on beef and pork and wheat shipped from Chicago across the Great Lakes, across either the railroads or the Erie Canal to New York City. So all of the factories and the people who worked in the factories of New York relied on Chicago for food, just as the American army relied on food that was processed in Chicago. In fact, in Chicago, during the Civil War, a new invention made it possible to preserve food, and these were the first canned goods. You know, when you buy a can of beans or something like that, this was invented during the Civil War so that the soldiers could have a can with beef or pork or chicken in their backpack, and they could open the can, and even if it was necessary, they could eat it cold. It wasn't going to spoil. So Chicago had to be rebuilt. The Civil War was over, but still, growing cities like Chicago, like New York, which was up to 1.5 million people, Boston, Philadelphia, growing new industrial cities like Cleveland and Pittsburgh and Buffalo, largely relied on the efficient food processing system of Chicago. So when the city burned, it was necessary to rebuild it as fast as possible. Well, Louis Sullivan, who's often considered the father of the skyscraper, brought all of these prerequisites together and started building up. Now, Chicago had room to expand. Chicago was not built on islands, so it could expand, but people didn't want to have to get in their horse and buggy and go miles over unpaved roads to get to the center of the city where they worked. For example, 1885, the Home Insurance Building, 12 floors. These could be built fast. The steel beams were made in giant factories. Plate glass was shipped by railroad to Chicago. And very often people were astonished that every day another floor rose on buildings such as the one we see before us. Now, these were office buildings, but you also had to house people. They were not going to build wooden buildings anymore. They wanted fireproof stone, glass, cement, steel buildings. So the people had to be housed. Industries had to be rebuilt. Streets had to be repaved. And so Louis Sullivan said, the skyscraper is the answer. So Chicago became the first city to build skyscrapers, not because they love skyscrapers, but because they had to. On the left, we see the city of the century, the epic of Chicago and the making of America. Chicago, after the fire, was in the forefront of building new cities and building them up in the air. 1899, we see the Bayard Convict Building on Bleecker Street. This is a fascinating example of a skyscraper going up, but look at the decorations on the front. Every floor has decorations, the entrance. Why were these buildings so beautifully decorated? Well, don't forget, in the 1880s, the country was being flooded with Italian immigrants. The Italians, since the time of the Romans, loved to make statues, decorations during the Italian Renaissance, artwork, frescoes, mosaics, statues. So all these Italians who were flooding into the United States brought their skills with them. And so these buildings, look at the angel standing there with her wings out, surrounded by flowers and decorations. Even the windows are beautifully decorated. So decorations were possible. But the element of the skyscraper is there. Look at the size of those windows. Look at the ground floor. Big storefront windows were possible. And they had steel beams supporting it. So you didn't have to have pillars everywhere. Interior lighting, electricity. Not all the buildings faced the street and had a lot of sunshine. There were buildings insides and bathrooms and auditoriums and meeting rooms, and they needed electric light. You had elevators going up to the top. Here again, you needed electricity for all of this. So the city of Chicago and later on started building skyscrapers. Well, eventually the skyscraper came to New York. Now, there was no great New York fire that destroyed everything. It was actually booming population. One of the very first and most dramatic skyscrapers was the Flatiron Building, which is on 23rd Street in Manhattan, where Fifth Avenue and Broadway intersect. Now, it's called the Flatiron because in the middle picture, you see a flatiron. This is what women use to iron clothing. In fact, I have one of these, which I found at a junk store for $2. Going back to the 1800s. They'd put it on a stove and it would get hot, and then they would iron until it cools off. Then they'd have to put it back on the stove. Back then, you had to iron everything. Well, the building, as you can see on the right and on the left, was narrow, pointed at one side, and it expanded as it went back. So it looked like a flatiron sailing up from lower Manhattan and going northward. Some people described it as a ship sailing up Manhattan. Well, when it was built at 22 floors, it was actually the tallest building in New York City. And it was the tallest building in the world. On the left, you see the steel beams going up, gradually being covered over with stone or terracotta, which is a type of baked clay. If you look closely at the right, you will see that the whole exterior, way up at the top, is once again decorated by predominantly Italian artists. Look at the picture on the right with the top with the two statues, decorations all over the place, all over the front. In the middle picture, the face and the wreath around it, completely covered with beautiful artwork. That's the type of thing that you could never build today. You could build a building, but it would be totally without decorations because you could never afford to hire the workers. Now, on the left, you see the layout of the building, the point up on 23rd Street, like a flatiron or like a ship, getting bigger the further back it went. Now, all of these offices had windows, which was a good advantage. But inside was the core, and that's where the elevators were. That's where bathrooms were located. That's where the stairway was located. The cables for electricity, the cables for gas and water, all that was in the inner core. Well, the Flatiron Building is rather small, so they could do that. But later on, as they built other buildings, You had offices on the inside, which had no windows whatsoever. And so buildings started getting more complex. Another building, which is still standing, is the Woolworth Building, founded by F.W. Woolworth. This was built in 1910, 1913. This one was twice as tall as the Flatiron Building, 57 floors. On the right, you see it as it stood when it was built, surrounded by smaller buildings, but soaring up into the sky. Now, I remember the Woolworth stores, which were all over the United States and still exist in Canada and Britain. Well, eventually, Woolworth stores were broken up into smaller stores, such as Foot Locker, Kids Gap, and a lot of these stores are all headquartered at the Woolworth Building. The architect was Cass Gilbert, who was one of the lovers of the early skyscrapers. But once again, look at the building, totally decorated with stone carvings and terracotta. The bottom on the left, you see F.W. Woolworth with his droopy mustache holding up his new tower. In the middle at the bottom, you see F.W. Woolworth counting his money, all the nickels and dimes that he earned from his stores. That's where we get the name 5 and dime store or 5 and 10 cent store. Back in 1910s and 20s, and 5 cents was something. Today, they would be 99-cent stores. And even now, it's 99 cents and up. So the whole building was covered both inside and outside with beautiful decorations, carvings, sculptures, such as the one in the middle, showing a workman that completely surrounded by flowers and other decorations. So gradually, Skyscraper became identified with New York. First, the Flatiron Building, which was the tallest in the world when it opened, and then the Woolworth Building, taking over in 1913. Until 1930, it was the tallest building in the world. Well, at the same time, New York was going underground. In 1904, the first subway line opened. Well, even before the first subway, we had trains which were running all over the city, but they were on the surface because they used steam engines. They burned coal to make the energy to run the train. So you'd have the big smokestack on the steam engine with smoke pouring out. Well, you sure couldn't put those underground. Well, by 1904, you had the first electric trains, which didn't pollute the air and didn't asphyxiate everybody. So in 1914, the subway went underground. And here you see the opening of the subway. Look at the men with their beards and big tall hats and women all dressed up down to the floor. I mean, this was a major occasion. The station we see here is the City Hall station. And in the middle, you see the first subway station. Behind it is today's City Hall. On the right, you see the map. It went from City Hall north to 42nd Street. 42nd Street, it went down to Times Square. And then it went up the west side, going the whole way up into the middle of Harlem. So this was an example of going underground, where people got used to being underground. They didn't want to live there, but if you could live up in a nice, beautiful brownstone in Harlem and zip down to your office on Wall Street or the City Hall or even Times Square or Grand Central, this was definitely an advantage. You didn't have to go outside. You ran to the station, went down, got on the train, and you were very quickly in lower Manhattan. Well, gradually skyscrapers started growing more and more. During the roaring 20s, the 1920s, the time of the Harlem Renaissance, the buildings got taller and taller. On the right, we see the famous Chrysler building, which was built between 1928 and 1930. 2 years to build this tall building with its aluminum, brand new invented metal. Aluminum did not rust. You just have to scrub it every once in a while, and it stayed nice and shiny. In the middle picture, you see a close-up of the tower at the top. Below that, you see a car from the 1920s with all of the nice, shiny aluminum that never rusted. And on the left, you see one of the aluminum decorations. And you see the workers up there polishing it. Well, for a very short time, the Chrysler building from May 27th, 1930 to April 30th, 1931, the Chrysler building replaced the Woolworth building as the tallest building in the world. Well, everybody was watching this transformation of the New York City landscape. Even during the 1920s, when Joseph Stalin was running Russia, he adopted this New York style architecture as the architecture of the future. In the middle picture, you see the Moscow State University, where I lectured when I lived in Moscow back in the collapse of the Soviet era. On the left, you see a tower which was never built, but of course it was once again celebrating Stalin at the top of a skyscraper. This was an office building, and Joseph Stalin leading the way into the future. So the skyscraper became part of Soviet architecture. Building buildings like the one in the middle all over Russia and later Central Asia, and following World War II, all over Poland and Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Latvia, because that was the architecture of the future. What does a skyscraper mean? Well, as Joseph Stalin said, it is a vision of the future. It's not an architecture from the Italian Renaissance or the Gothic architecture of the Middle Ages. It's not architecture of Greece or Rome or China or India or the Arab world. It is a whole new way of building buildings. And the skyscraper symbolized greatness. Even today, the dinkiest little town in the Midwest or in some place in Asia or Africa wants to have its skyscraper. That means you are future looking. That means you are a great city if you have your skyscraper. Well, the skyscraper took on an even more important message during the Great Depression, which began in 1929. Unemployment, millions of people lost their jobs. Businesses went bankrupt. My great-grandfather's 2 banks went bankrupt. His coal mines went bankrupt. Suicides on Wall Street were a common event. Luckily, my great-grandfather didn't commit suicide because he was smart enough to invest in orange groves in Florida. So he simply packed up and left Pennsylvania and went down to Florida and took care of his orange groves. So he didn't commit suicide. But there were riots in the streets, in the cities where all the people living in shanty towns, as you can see in the middle picture, Parks were taken over by the unemployed. If you didn't have a job, your business went belly up, you didn't have any money, well, you got kicked out of your apartment. Similar thing which is happening today with COVID. So many people lose their jobs. The big danger is, are they going to be living homeless on the streets? Economic decline. People started saying, is American capitalism a mistake? Should we become communists? Should we abandon capitalism and have some other form of business? And was the United States on the way down? Was the United States going to decline as a major power? Well, certain people like the Reverend Norman Vincent Peale of Marble Collegiate Church said, New York has to lead the way. It has to show the country and the world that New York is still the Empire City. And our responsibility was to show the world that we could think positively and overcome the Great Depression. Well, the city fathers and many businessmen in New York decided that New York had to lead the way out of the Depression. So at 32nd Street and Fifth Avenue, they decided to build the Empire State Building. At 102 floors, world's tallest, from 1931, when it opened, to 1972. So it was a symbol of New York's greatness. New York State is the Empire State. New York City is the Empire City. It was modern architecture, not a lot of decorations, soaring up into the sky at 102 floors. Now, when the Empire State Building opened, it was empty, with all the businesses going bankrupt and business leaders leaving the town or committing suicide. When the building opened in 1931, it was empty. In fact, people jokingly called it the Empty State Building, because there was no need for all these offices. But the city fathers said, mark my word, one day this building will be filled with businesses, rents will skyrocket, and New York will again be the Empire City. So the skyscraper became a symbol of positive thinking about the future. Well, of course, it was sort of ridiculed in the beginning as being empty, but it did become, again, a symbol with the great King Kong movie of 1933, where you see King Kong, the animal, fighting against the Empire State Building. It really made the Empire State Building world famous. Everybody saw it and everybody marveled. And look at the way it is, completely surrounded by smaller buildings. Only on the right can you see the Chrysler Building, which preceded it by a year. But on the left, you see it is literally a giant in the middle of Manhattan. Unfortunately, today it is more surrounded by skyscrapers like the Flatiron Building. It's difficult to get a nice view of it because it is just being swamped by skyscrapers. But in 1930s, when it was new, it really was a dramatic monument. Also during the Great Depression, John D. Rockefeller Jr. came up with a plan to build Rockefeller Center. Look at the map on the right, you see Rockefeller Center, and you see the red line. Look at 52nd Street, 51st Street, down to 47th and 48th Street, with Fifth Avenue on one side. This was one giant complex of 19 buildings. Now here again, you see the top of the rock, the tallest building in Rockefeller Center, surrounded by another 18 buildings. Well, this was an example of not only building up, but building down. Because underneath all these buildings, there's a subway station. There are shopping arcades. There's even a post office because Rockefeller Center has its own zip code. And you can go from building to building underground. So you could live on Long Island or in Bronx, take the subway down, the B, D, the F, and the V, get off of the subway and stay your entire day underground. Banks, stores, post office, restaurants, Radio City Music Hall, all kinds of other buildings and industries inside this giant complex. Well, of course, when it opened in 1930, once again, everybody laughed and said, look, you spent all this money on these wonderful things, even well decorated with sculptures and Atlas on the right, big ice skating rink surrounded by restaurants. But once again, it was empty. So it was a symbol again that New York will bounce back from the Great Depression and once again lead the country and the world into greatness. Well, Rockefeller Center was different than the Empire State Building or the Flatiron, which are simply one building. Rockefeller Center was a complex of 19 buildings, nicely arranged with subways and parks and ice skating rinks and all kinds of restaurants, a city of many buildings inside a city, whereas the Empire State Building and the Flatiron Building and the Woolworth Building were one building standing somewhere in the city. Well, John D. Rockefeller and his architects were inspired by Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier was a European, Swiss and French, I believe, architect who came up with the idea of stop building one building at a time, but build a complex of buildings which are linked underground, have underground parking garages, have a subway station, and are surrounded by grass and trees and a park. This really became very popular around the world, and it inspired people who were building places like Rockefeller Center. Not just one building, but a city within a city. And so you could surround your buildings, as you can see in the picture on the left, trees and parkland and areas for children to play in the playground. This was a whole new type of urban living, and Rockefeller Center was a good example. Also in New York, this Le Corbusier method of the tower in the park took root in places like Peter Cooper Village and Stuyvesant Town in the 1940s, where miles of tenements, like we see in the picture at the top, buildings 5 and 6 floors with very often no elevators, little stores on the bottom. These were demolished by the thousands and replaced with the cluster of towers that you see on the bottom, on the right, and on the left. Once again, they were surrounded by parks, playgrounds. People could walk around. Public transportation was available. There were community centers, supermarkets. And this really became the symbol. So it wasn't so much building up or down anymore, but it was much more building intense, heavily populated urban environments. So throughout all this time, the Empire State Building still ruled supreme as the tallest building in the city. Well, this started changing. By the 1960s, New York was deteriorating. It was dangerous to go to Central Park, which was overrun with weeds and criminals and drug addicts. The city was losing population because cities on the West Coast, such as Chicago, was growing, and especially Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego. It was the age of the Pacific Rim. Well, New York was a disaster in the eyes of many people. And so the city had to do something. I'm sure we all saw the movie Escape from New York. Well, in 1973, the city fathers decided that it was time to build a brand new city. The decline of New York was well advertised. It was the 1960s and 70s, fierce city, New York's fiscal crisis, and the rise of austerity politics. Austerity means stop spending money. Let the subway deteriorate. Let Central Park go back to the jungle. Don't repave the streets and fill in potholes. Cut back on the schools and education. Smoke and mirrors, the war on drugs and the politics of failure, the rise of drug addiction all over the city. In fact, in 1975, the city got so bad, it was facing outright bankruptcy. Well, the mayor asked President Ford in Washington, "Will you lend us money so we don't go bankrupt?" And according to the Daily News, President Ford told New York City, "Drop dead." So the city was in rapid decline. In 1974, the Willis Tower in Chicago replaced the Empire State Building as the tallest building in the world. And New Chicago was very proud, saying, "New York is ancient history. We are now #1 in America." Chicago had replaced New York as the home of the tallest building in the world. Los Angeles was booming in population. See the growth, 1900, barely any population in Los Angeles County. By the 1970s and 80s, it was almost as large as New York City and gradually reaching 10 million people. So Los Angeles was the new city of the future. America was in decline. Books such as In the Shadows of the American Century, The Rise and Decline of the US as a Global Power, The End of the Age of America, showing that the United States was becoming a second-rate power. So this was a very scary time for New York. And how was the New York government, business, population going to respond? Asia, the Pacific Rim, as it was called, was replacing the Atlantic Rim. New York was on the Atlantic and faced Europe, the old world. Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego were on the Pacific coast facing the New World, rising Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, eventually China, Vietnam, Singapore. This was the world of the future. Well, what did New York do in this terrible situation? Well, it decided once again to celebrate the fact that New York was still the Empire City. We don't care what other people are saying. We are number one. So the city fathers and business people decided to build the tallest building in the world. 110 floors, and not just one of them, but two of them at the bottom of Manhattan on landfill out in the Hudson River. And Nimuro Yamasaki, the architect who designed the building, described it as such. He said, "The World Trade Center is a living symbol of man's dedication to world peace, a representation of man's belief in humanity, his need for individual dignity, his beliefs in the cooperation of men, and through cooperation, his ability to find greatness." So it wasn't just another building going up. It had spiritual, political, economic, and social meaning. Well, as we know, the tower went up and they both went down. Well, many people said that the tower was built too fast. The architecture was experimental. We're still dealing with steel beams. We're still dealing with electricity, plate glass, elevators, indoor lighting. All of this was in the World Trade Center. But many people said that it was built too fast and it was dangerous. Well, of course, the 9/11 Commission report by the American government, of course, painted a rosy picture that the building was safe, it was sound, that it was these terrible terrorists who took it out. But a lot of debates emerged because of the tower. Now, I was living in Queens when this happened, and I heard about it and jumped on the train, got to Jackson Heights in Queens, where the 7 train is above ground. And so I ran up the steps, took the train into the city, ran across the Queensboro Bridge. And right when I was in the middle of the bridge, I saw the second tower collapse in front of me. I even took pictures of it. I spent the whole day in Lower Manhattan taking pictures, interviewing people. So it was a major event for me. Well, the World Trade Center was built, as you can see in the picture on the left. The inner core was where the bathrooms, the elevators, the stairways, the gas and water and electric lines were in the center core. Well, the steel beams were only around the outside. So you see the inner core, then you have a big white spot, and then you see the outline of the building, meaning there was nothing between these outside pillars and the central pillar. So it's basically like a building with a pencil in the middle holding up the entire floor, and almost nothing holding up one floor from the next. So what they call the exterior columns on the outside were the only things that stopped or slowed down the airplane, and then it went through open space and poured all of the gasoline and everything into the inner core. On the right, you see the picture there where it says exterior columns on the outside. And then in the center, you see the blue columns supporting the elevators and all that. But between the exterior columns and the central core, there was nothing because people wanted offices that were open. Everybody wanted a window. And so there were no walls between the exterior and the interior columns. They were just plastic partitions. So you could stand up and you could yell at the person working beside you. Even the big boss just had a corner cubicle with maybe glass windows or something, but no pillars. So the airplane went through the exterior columns with almost no resistance and plowed into the center column, which made evacuating the building almost impossible because the stairs, the elevators were saturated with gasoline and went up in flames. And that was one of the great problems of the World Trade Center. Was the architecture of these new skyscrapers dangerous? Is it possible to evacuate a building like this that is so tall? Well, this was a lot of controversy. The older buildings, such as the one we see on the right, the Empire State Building, had the outside exterior pillars. It had the interior with the elevators and everything with pillars, but there were pillars scattered throughout the building. So those little black dots. So if an airplane would have plowed into the Empire State Building, as it did, forget what year it was, well, all of these outside pillars would break up the airplane. The interior pillars would demolish it even further. So very little would get to the central core. And so the people could evacuate by the steps. Well, this was a major criticism of new style skyscrapers. Fewer pillars, more big, open, airy space, and everything crammed into the center. Well, of course, when the government investigated it, they seriously discussed whether the World Trade Center was bad architecture. Well, this is still being debated. You can be sure the American Institute of Steel Construction did not want its steel building criticized. The architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth demanded investigations, but architectural groups, city planning groups, the politicians who approved it and inspected it did not want architecture to be mentioned as a problem with the World Trade Center. And so most of the information on whether the World Trade Center was safe architecture or dangerous or experimental, all of these debates were pretty well hush-hushed. Few journalists would bring it up because real estate agents, government officials, city officials, engineers, architects, steel makers, all wanted this whole debate to be silenced. So today we are building more and more tall towers in the model of the World Trade Center. Picture on the left, you see 59th Street facing Central Park. Another 8 tiny pencil towers, they call them, going up. And these are all built like the World Trade Center. Picture in the middle, you have your perimeter, your outside columns, you see the central core, but nothing between the outside columns and the core. In fact, the building at 111 West 57th Street is well on its way to becoming the tallest pencil tower in the city, so that a person can buy for a couple $100 million an entire floor and have windows into his apartment on all 4 sides. These are very narrow, very experimental. You can imagine what would happen if an airplane would crash into that. It would simply smash it in 2. And the question is, are these pencil towers safe or not? So we're dealing here with the continuation of experimental and possibly dangerous architecture. Here's another view of famous 111 West 57th Street, soaring above the city. On the picture on the left, you see another tower going up, pencil thin, but with spectacular views. If anybody knows anybody who's going to move in there, have them invite me over for dinner sometime, just to see the view of the city from one of the top apartments. Well, New York is racing to the top. 111 West 57th Street, while it's not the tallest building in the country or in the city, it is at 60 feet, absolutely breathtaking. Other ones will be built around the 225 West 57th Street, Central Park South, 53rd West 53rd Street. All of these pencil towers, they call them super skinny towers. Once again, very experimental architecture. Well, New York is not the only place involved in building more and more skyscrapers. On the left, you see the Chrysler Building, which was tallest for a couple of months compared to the Eiffel Tower, and then Empire State Building, Petronas Towers in Malaysia, Taipei in Taiwan, the World Trade Center. It was the tallest because it put that little spire on the top. So that was sort of cheating, but that's how you measure things. Willis Tower, then you had the Torre Osaka in Moscow, and then you had Toronto, Canton Tower, the Burj Khalifa, 2010, once again claiming the status of the tallest tower in the world. This is the Burj Khalifa, and that's me when I visited the tower. Once again, I mean, absolutely breathtaking view, but when you get to the top, you see that Dubai is simply a small town surrounded by desert, but you do get a spectacular view of the Persian Gulf. China is in the lead in building skyscrapers. When you look at the old traditional Chinese architecture, such as Xi'an on the left, the postcard where I spent a wonderful vacation, and then the skyline of Shanghai, where I spent another vacation. Pudong is a city of brand new skyscrapers built on swamp. Hong Kong is filling itself with skyscrapers because, as you can see, its back is against a mountain. So like New York, it had to build upward. Brasilia, where I spent a wonderful vacation January a couple years ago. Here again, we see the modern city. the tall towers at the bottom of this grand plaza, which is the Congress of the country of Brazil. And so the skyscraper, ultra-modern architecture, is a symbol of the future. Now, Brasilia didn't have to build upward, and it didn't, because it had the space to expand outward. But Abuja in Nigeria, a brand new city built in the middle of the country, once again highlights the skyscraper as a symbol of modern Nigeria, no longer tribal peoples living in the past, but proud new Nigerian young people becoming computer programmers, traveling around the world and building their skyscraper-filled city of the future. Astana, the new capital of Kazakhstan, the former Soviet republic, once again featuring sleek, towering skyscrapers, giant boulevards, highways, fountains. This is the city of the future, the skyscraper city. Everybody is competing once again to have the tallest skyscraper. In fact, they're constantly updating the website titled 20 Tallest Future Skyscrapers. The one on the right, interestingly, is planned for New York City. The other ones are being built around the world. The one on the left, we think of Corbusier, the tower inside a park. When you pack so many people in such a small space, you can build a park around it. So that brings us to an end of this exciting exploration of the skyscraper. And we are still in the age of the skyscraper. So I'm a great lover of skyscrapers. So whenever the new one goes up that's going to be the tallest, I have to go and visit it. So there you see me at the top of the Burj Khalifa, which, as I speak, I believe, as of this morning, was still the tallest building in the world. But when I was in Ethiopia on vacation, I was stunned by the future visions of Ethiopia. And when they had these conferences, I mean, all of the posters and the pictures for the future of Ethiopia was once again dominated by giant skyscrapers. And these were being built when I was there. Chinese were investing very heavily in Ethiopia, building entire clusters of skyscrapers in downtown Addis Ababa. Unfortunately, as I speak to you, Ethiopia is in a civil war, and so its progress is temporarily halted. But still, the future is upward, and the skyscraper will remain forever the symbol of greatness and of the future. So this is Ron Brown, Dr. Ronald Brown. You see him ronbrownmedia@gmail.com if you'd like to contact me. Signing off, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture on New York City's contribution to the world, the skyscraper. So thank you very, very much. Thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you again in the future for another exciting lecture. I just noticed I'm wearing the same sweatshirt now with the VTS. I don't know what VTS stands for. I found it in the subway and I needed a sweatshirt. So it's become my travel sweatshirt because it's dark, it doesn't show up the dirt, and I can wash it in my hotel room. So once again, that's me. Thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you in the future.